unintentionally maybe self-sabotaging our current relationships if we don't really have an understanding of how that past trauma has impacted us and left us with wounds that may need addressed. So, in many relationships, whenever things are going really well in the beginning, those trauma symptoms can be kind of overlooked and set aside. But whenever relationships start to get more close, when you're more vulnerable, when things start to get more serious, those trauma reactions or trauma triggers can really rear their ugly heads. And many of us don't even know that it's happening because we're not even aware that we've experienced trauma or that our body is reacting to a traumatic memory or a traumatic experience. So, for example, sometimes whenever people have had traumatic childhoods, like we've talked about, or traumatic relationships in the past where maybe their ex sabotaged birthdays, so every time they had some sort of holiday or event, there was a conflict, there was a fight that happened. And so sometimes whenever this happens for a person who's experienced that, when they are away from that relationship, they replicate that experience, which seems counterproductive, but we often don't even know we're doing it. So they may kind of start a fight before their birthday or start a fight before a holiday event because they are in their bodies preparing for battle because they're used to that history of continual attack during those times that should be enjoyable, that should be honoring you and should be helping you feel supported and loved, but instead they are triggering that I'm unsafe and that I need to protect myself experience. So often that requires a fight response. So someone is creating that situation where they're ready to fight and their current partner might be totally baffled by what's going on, that they're starting fights with things that don't make sense, or they're exceptionally stressed out and your current partner may not know what's happening. And this can happen even if you are newly dating and you're maybe having an event that's coming up that you're practiced at getting kind of traumatized around historically with either family or in a past relationship. So having those experiences kind of hardwire your body to go, okay, it's time for fight or flight. We're having a birthday, we're having a holiday event, and something stressful is going to happen. So that can kind of unintentionally cause some self-sabotage in those relationships where you think your mind, your limbic system, your animalistic part of your brain is going, I have to survive, so I have to protect myself, and you're unintentionally creating conflict in your relationship, which you may or may not have known was even there. So that's just one way that people can take that kind of traumatic reaction or traumatic response with them to current relationships or future relationships if they're not aware that they're having that trauma reaction around those situations, that they have been kind of hardwired to have that fight experience whenever they are in that situation to try and protect themselves, then they can unintentionally recreate those experiences. Another way that people tend to respond to trauma is they dissociate. So this is where we kind of leave our body emotionally, where we're present, we seem engaged even at times, but that there's a part of us that's checked out. There's a part of us that's kind of just observing what's happening and isn't really present and engaged in the moment. In reality, they're somewhere else in their mind. They're protecting themselves in some other way. So maybe this person has learned that it's unsafe to express or feel their emotions through traumatic events in their lives. And so their body's way of coping is to check out, is I'm going to leave the building. And often these trauma responses are trauma responses that have happened in childhood that have been kind of reinforced in adult traumatic relationships or traumatic situations. So many people who dissociate or who kind of leave their body or check out or feel numb, they don't know that they're really doing this per se, but they don't know that they're doing this, but they are able to recognize that something's happening and it feels a little safer whenever I am not totally engaged. So they may kind of tune out mentally and kind of feel like they're not really listening because their bodies are actually tuning things out. And this seems like it's safer for people who are dissociating or checking out of their body, because if they're checked into their body, then things are too painful. The irony is that when we dissociate from our bodies, we are not able to really be as selective about this as we think we're being. So if we're checking out or numbing out for a situation that's stressful, that may be helpful in that moment, that it's a little too overwhelming and you're not able to deal with it in that place, so you can come back to it. But when we get practiced at dissociating or leaving our bodies mentally, we tend to create the habit of doing that continuously. And so many times this can lead to kind of forgetfulness or just an inability in general to feel emotions altogether. So this dissociation or this leaving our body, or kind of, it could even be described as kind of a freezing, that you're not really engaged, you're not really dealing with anything emotionally, can leave you feeling at a loss for a connection with your emotions in general. So although at some point in people's lives, dissociation may have been a resource that was essential. So especially like when we're children and we don't have other resources, sometimes that dissociation is their only survival mechanism. As a kid, we don't have the tools to get up and leave. All we have is the ability to kind of check out. And so although it may have served a purpose as a child, as an adult, it's required that we re-engage and we learn how to cope with these stressors or even traumatic events in a way that is more aware. So when we dissociate, we become unaware, and often this leads to some intrusive thoughts or some anxious thoughts that continue to kind of come back up and kick us when we're trying to ignore our feelings, but our thoughts are going, hello, you need to feel stuff because I'm going to antagonize you until you do. So we think that we're coping well because we're shutting down these emotions, we're not feeling these emotions, but these worrying thoughts or these intrusive thoughts are going to continue to come up and annoy us until we get reacquainted with our bodies and our emotions. So it is kind of a false sense of security when we're in the habit of dissociating and checking out. We can feel like that's familiar, it's comfortable. But the irony is it's creating more anxious thoughts, more anxious feelings, because that's our body's way of telling us, hello, you're alive, you need to feel things. And the beauty of not dissociating and reconnecting with your body and your emotions is that you can have a more broad spectrum of emotions that are easier to come up when you allow yourself to reconnect with your body and check back in. And it takes practice, because usually most people who have dissociated or have gotten into that fight mode have conditioned their body to do that, to respond in that way for many, many years. And it takes some real rewiring. So with the fight response, it takes some real practice in recognizing when you're feeling like you are needing to fight. What are those triggers that are happening for you? Like, what are you noticing in your body? For both dissociation and for that fight mode, what are you noticing in your body that's happening before the dissociation happens or before that fight mode happens? So for the fighter, maybe you're starting to feel your heart race, or you're starting to get tense, or maybe your breath is shorter or more shallow. So that's a good clue is we can get checked into our body sensations. It can let us know that something that's not so helpful, like that fight mode or the dissociation mode, is about to happen. So especially for the dissociations, since we stay kind of in a state of not really connected, is really noticing some of those mindful things that we've talked about in some of those other videos, is just noticing what it feels like to be present in your chair, sitting with your legs on the chair, with your feet on the ground, noticing what it feels like to breathe in air, Noticing what it feels like to fill up your lungs, noticing what it feels like to have whatever temperature your hands are, or whatever your temperature your feet are, or whatever temperature the room is, or whatever sense that you experience. I like to have candles because they help me to stay present in the moment and notice that sense that's happening. So those sensory connections help you to get reacquainted and reconnected and rewire your brain to engage in a more thoughtful reaction as opposed to the autopilot that trauma history can get us kind of trained and conditioned to do. So getting reacquainted with your body, getting reacquainted with what those triggers, those signals are that are letting you know, hey, something's happening for your body. It's okay for you to sit with it. And then to let your body be in those moments where you're noticing, like, oh gosh, my birthday's coming up. I'm feeling really anxious or stressed out, or I'm getting a little frustrated that it's going to go badly. And how does that feel in my body? Do I feel it in my chest? Do I feel it on my shoulders? Do I feel it in my stomach? Where is that happening? Does it give me a headache? Where is it happening for you in your body to really get, again, reacquainted with what's happening for you? And I like to encourage people to support themselves like they would their best friend or someone they love and care about, right? You wouldn't tell your best friend or someone you care about, well, stop feeling things, right? Or you wouldn't tell them, well, why don't you go punch somebody? You'd tell them, like, gosh, that's really hard that you're feeling overwhelmed right now, that your emotions are kind of feeling like they're taking over. You feel really sad. That's hard to feel that way. I'm sorry that you're struggling with that, right? You'd be empathetic and understanding and loving. You wouldn't be critical and hurtful and try to make them stop feeling what they're feeling, like we do to ourselves. So really being your own best friend in those moments and allowing yourself permission to just sit. And again, those thoughts are going to float by, especially if you're having those intrusive thoughts or those self-critical thoughts. Those thoughts are going to continue to come up because they're conditioned that way. It's kind of like a bad thought habit. Is you're just noticing those thoughts, and instead of continuing to feed those thoughts, you're going to let those thoughts float on by, and again, go back to the body, go back to the breath, go back to feeling those physical sensations and what that feels like in your body, and really just allowing yourself to rewire that trauma response. It's doable, and it takes consistency, and it takes hard work, and it takes repetition, because we probably spend a lot of times repeating these less effective habits over time. They say that it takes 21 days to establish a habit, so continuing to keep trying. And it doesn't mean it's going to be perfect. None of us are perfect. Some of these things are going to come back over time, especially if there's particularly traumatic or stressful events that are happening. That might be your go-to response, and that's okay. It's just noticing that that's happening, and how do you get back to reconnecting with your body and yourself and being present and allowing yourself to feel emotions as if you would support a friend, right? Like, I'm okay. It's okay to feel this emotion. It's really hard to have those thoughts, and now I'm feeling very sad, or I'm feeling really worried. But really being present with that and noticing what that's like to allow those emotions to come up, and noticing what your tendency is. Whether is it to fight? Is it to dissociate? So, and there's other possibilities too, but these are just two examples of some ways in which our past trauma can cause us to respond in a way that's maybe not so helpful for us, and some tools to learn, hopefully, to shift things up in a way that's going to make it a little more easy to cope with this experience, with just regular stressors, and learning whenever triggers come up in relationships, how to work through those in a little bit more productive way. Thank you for watching. I hope this has been helpful.